I now invite Marnie Golden to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which you'll find printed in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service. Sorry about that. Saying, love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Just as we were emerging from the pandemic only about 2.5 years ago, it's startling to realize, a book with an unpromising title, Slouching Towards Utopia, became an instant bestseller. Its author, Brad DeLong, had been a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in President Clinton's administration and afterward became a professor of economic history at the University of California at Berkeley. Its subtitle was An Economic History of the 20th Century, and it offered plenty of critiques about the ways we have thought over the last 150 years or so about economics, or as I think we should go back to calling it, political economy. The reason we started calling that field the study of economics was hubris, really, a hubris DeLong called out in his first couple of chapters. He did it in perhaps too partisan a way, making the Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek into a bit of a punching bag. You might remember former House Speaker Paul Ryan and others like him praising Hayek's genius some years back. Also, DeLong put great emphasis on how markets reward those who own property, which I read as a rebuke to Judge Richard Posner, also admired on the right, who, applying a theory developed by the economist Ronald Coase, endorsed assigning property rights as a method to solve legal cases. He thought that asking the question, who owns what, and if the answer isn't clear, then deciding or negotiating who owns what, yields clarity and resolves the legal dispute. Using Hayek as a symbol of the neoliberal consensus on U.S. economic policy that until recently reigned supreme, DeLong uses as a contrasting symbol a much lesser-known economist, Karl Polanyi. Born in Budapest, Polanyi was a senior editor in the 1920s of a Vienna-based weekly called The Austrian Economist, where he became a leading critic of free market enthusiasts like Hayek. When Hitler came to power, he moved to England and later to the United States. After World War II, he taught at Columbia University, and he died in 1964. Polanyi's academic pursuits led him to investigate how social anthropology could inform economic theory. His best-known book, The Great Transformation, made many of the same critiques of free market capitalism as DeLong does. Polanyi argued that from the outset, economics was a utopian project. Adam Smith and his circle sought to disembed the political economy from social relations, culture, and politics, which was a utopian dream, never a real possibility. Whenever we have tried to make social, cultural, or political matters subordinate to economic ones, as free market advocates have repeatedly recommended, bad things have followed. The way that DeLong makes Hayek and Polanyi into symbols is by summarizing each of their views in a short, pithy proverb. For Hayek, it's, "The market giveth, the market taketh away. Blessed be the name of the market." For Polanyi, it's, "The market was made for man, not man for the market." It's not insignificant that for Hayek, he chose to parody a line from the book of Job, while for Polanyi, he parodied one of the red-letter gospel passages. None too subtle from a Christian theological perspective. As I say, it's easy to read partisanship into DeLong's prose. In the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, the organ of the Austrian School of Economics associated with Hayek, the review of his book was particularly acid. And that's too bad, because Polanyi's critiques of market capitalism deserve serious consideration. Beacon Press has thought so, our Unitarian Universalist publishing organization. The Great Transformation was first published in 1944, not by Beacon, but Beacon published new editions in 1957 and again in 2001. And in 1968, Beacon was the original publisher of a collection of Polanyi's essays that was republished alongside the 2001 edition of The Great Transformation. At this moment of general consensus that the neoliberal prescriptions for economic policy have failed us, DeLong's revival of Polanyi's critiques is appropriate and timely. Well, all of that is context for what I really want to talk about this morning. In a chapter titled Inclusion, DeLong sketched how he sees the problem of economic justice. From roughly 1800 to 1870, he wrote, "New developments in technology and organization seemed to be opening the door to a better world, and humanity started to walk through that door." But in the following years, 1914 to 1949 or so, the utopia beyond the door proved elusive as humanity grappled with a world war, a major depression, and another world war. There were also civil and revolutionary wars. The last of these, China's, which did not end until 1949, brought with it a famine in which between 50 and 100 million people died. Technology and organization, rather than acting to free and enrich, were increasingly used to kill and oppress. If one looked only at the ideological challenges, the political mechanisms, and the dilemmas of growth and distribution during this period, one would not have found much basis for optimism in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And I'll just mention here, thinking of that horrible famine in China. In 1998, Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work analyzing famines. He had shown that famines do not result from a lack of food, but rather from a failure to distribute it. It seems to me that supports DeLong's point about the impact of technology and organization, particularly organization. And yet, DeLong continued, after World War II, the world, or at least the global north, picked up its mat and walked, nay, ran forward toward utopia. You noticed the biblical reference there, right? Jesus told the man who had been an invalid for 38 years, pick up your mat and walk. 38 years is roughly the length of the period of the wars and depression and famine that DeLong just described. It's a very careful choice on his part. The global north picked up its mat and ran, he said. Growth was faster than ever before. Unemployment was low. Incomes were not too unequally distributed, at least if you were a white guy who had been born in the global north. And the boom-bust business cycle was very moderate. It was closer to material utopia for white guys in the global north than ever before, and rapidly getting closer still. But still, this was only true for white guys. And then DeLong went on to describe the familiar oppressions of patriarchy and racism in the rest of that chapter. Now, what brought DeLong's book back to mind for me was another book I just read that raises questions I'm still pondering, that feel related to the experience we are all having of overwhelm from the fire hose of executive orders and actions since January 20th. Stephen Valachi's Capitalisms and Gay Identities examines how different practices of capitalism at different moments in history have shaped liberation movements for sexual and gender minorities over time, and how these movements have identified and portrayed themselves. Valachi covers a similar period of time as DeLong, from the later 19th century to the present, and names the different historical practices of capitalism this way. Monopoly capitalism in the late 19th century, the Gilded Age. Reform capitalism in the early 20th century, the Progressive Era. Social contract capitalism in the post-World War II boom. Capitalism in crisis in the 1970s, and neoliberal capitalism since 1980. That's the thing that just really everybody decided didn't work. Or it seems like that's what everybody decided. To quickly sketch Valachi's account, under monopoly and reform capitalism, unprecedentedly large-scale production and government regulation together produced first produced a leisure class and then a middle class. The first organized liberation movement for sexual minorities, the homophile movement, emerged in the 1950s when the same beliefs in science and organization that produced plenty and also medicalized and marginalized sexual minorities, homophile activists sought to portray themselves as normal, healthy, middle-class citizens. He's saying that that economy, that social, the culture that it produced, created this preferred self-expression of that liberation movement. The gay rights movement emerged in the 1970s at a time when social contract capitalism, the era when big corporations for the first time provided all kinds of benefits that effectively supplemented or participated in the economic safety net. That was the norm, but was about to spiral into capitalism in crisis after the OPEC embargo, when the word stagflation was coined to describe economic conditions that weren't responding to the usual government interventions. Progress for women and racial minorities under social contract capitalism inspired gay rights activists to portray themselves as a similar minority with a similar claim to equal rights. As capitalism in crisis took hold, this sort of identity became increasingly contested within the gay rights movement. And then he says, since the 1990s, after neoliberal capitalism, the thing that just failed, got established in the 1980s as the answer to capitalism in crisis, At that point, the national gay rights movement began to take a more corporatized and bureaucratized form, and the domesticated, consumerist gay identity took hold, influenced by the more market-centered ideas about the economy. Wow, right? I mean, he's describing things that, you can read about, were real. Those self-portrayals historically are real, but to explain them this way is something, oh wow. Okay. Now, Valachi does identify himself as a neo-Marxist, so that's why he wants to base it on the economy. And it is clear that he brings that lens to his analysis. He does seem to lean into economic determinism a bit, but he points to real observable phenomenon in these liberal movements. Part of advocating for non-discrimination, acceptance, rights, equality, or equity is how you represent yourself or your group to your neighbors. And public discourse does produce ideals of good citizenship and stereotypes of normalcy and boundaries of social acceptability. So whether or not our system of political economy determines that discourse, our shared understanding of economic matters is a factor that shapes what we think is true, acceptable, prudent, and possible for ourselves and our society. But this is a moment when the consensus about the political economy is in flux. The neoliberal team fumbled, failed to score on the fourth down, and what's happening now in our political theater is a fight over the rules of the game. The next thing we know, we might be arguing over what's dribbling and what's traveling, or how many strikes make it out. And the team controlling the ball right now just seems to want to control a lot more. Is it a game? I think we would all agree that a relationship is better than a transaction. It's more satisfying, it offers more, it has the most potential, and it grows deeper roots. And as we know, it is relationships, not transactions, that most shape and define us. Through them, we discover who we are in more depth, the more we invest in them. I think that's why neoliberalism failed. It was all about subordinating our relationships to our transactions. The idea that we can use free markets to automate our economic responsibilities to one another has always been an impossible fantasy. That's why I think it's healthier and more honest to speak of our political economy rather than a science of economics, as though our transactions were governed by natural laws. They're governed by us. We should at least acknowledge the politics of it and assess the social relationships within which our transactions occur. I also think that's why our current situation feels to so many, and has been named by so many, as a crisis of democracy, so far as democracy concerns our relationships as neighbors and not just power games played by voting. It is. It is a crisis of democracy. Eric Holthaus wrote, "Our literal journey into space to send a robot to help us answer the most fundamental questions about ourselves shows us we are capable of so much more." In this historical moment, may we lean into our relationships to create a more just society and come to know and to say who we truly are at our best. So may it be. Amen.
I invite Marnie to come back up and extinguish our chalice. And please join me in the closing words, which are in the order of service, saying,
Peace, have courage, hold fast to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, and honor all beings. And may we do what we can to help and to plant hope.